それではブリュンヒルデさん、どうかよろしくお願いいたします。
Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you. President Utsumi, Ambassador Eileen, honored guests, dear guests, hello everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today, and I'm so honored to be invited to speak with you. This is my first time in Japan, and I have long wanted to visit your wonderful country, especially since I have a Japanese family. My aunt, Sari Oyama, and my two cousins, Mariko Margret and Mamiko Dies. My name is Brynhildur Heiðar and Omar's daughter, and I run the Icelandic Women's Rights Association. Right. The Icelandic Women's Rights Association is the oldest civil society in Iceland working towards gender equality. We were founded in 1907 by Bríet Bjarthénsdóttir, here pictured, to fight for women's suffrage or women's right to vote. The original charter of the association mandated that we fight for a political equality between men and women, as well as equal access to education, political appointments, and the workplace. This mandate remains the same today, even though it is articulated differently. Our mission, according to our current charter, is to work on women's rights and the equal status of all genders in all areas of society. The association takes an inclusive view of human rights and works against all areas of discrimination. This wider definition of equality, which undergirds our work today, is absolutely essential, because our understanding of equality and of humanity has changed as we have grown as a society. In recent years, Iceland has welcomed many immigrants who bring with them new opportunities and new challenges. As we become more diverse, we have needed to broaden our understanding and practice of equality. We can no longer afford to only think of equality in terms of women and men. Our understanding needs to be more inclusive of other areas of discrimination, such as discrimination based on sexual orientation, discrimination based on gender identity, race, religion, or disability, and all other areas. Iceland, even though we are considered #1 in the world in gender equality, Iceland is still a fundamentally unequal society. But we have come a long way since 1907 in bridging the gap between men and women, between the genders. Today, I want to talk about some of the legislative and policy tools that we have used to create a more equal society, and about the political movements that made these changes possible. Because social change doesn't come from legislative changes, but from political action. Without the political movement of women, without women organizing and demonstrating and running for office, nothing would change. Nothing would change. People, or shall I say it, men in power, don't easily share power. It is up to us, the voters, to demand changes, to demand equality for all. The fundamental right of everyone is the right to vote, the right of the people to have a say in the way that we are governed. Women in Iceland received the right to vote in local elections in Reykjavik in 1907, and a year later they organized and formed their own political party, the Women's List, and ran for city council. This first women's list in Iceland won a major legislative victory. In fact, in 1908, the Women's List became the single largest party in the city council of Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. Why? Well, because the women were the only ones who bothered to talk to all the new voters, the women. So of course, the women voted for them. The success of the women's list in 1908 created a template for political action in Iceland, and women's political parties have been created at various points in our history. We gained the right to vote and run for national office in 1915, and the first woman elected to parliament, Ingibjörg Bjarnason, in 1922, was elected from a women's list. The most successful women's party was created in 1983. This new women's alliance was represented in parliament until 1998, and in fact, the last woman originally elected to parliament as part of the Women's Alliance only left parliament 2 years ago, in 2016. So why did women in Iceland feel compelled to create their own parties? Well, the reason is simple. Men in established political parties did not offer women opportunities to run for office. They did not share their power. Here is a chart of the gender ratio of the members of Alþingi, the Icelandic parliament, since 1916, the first elections where women were allowed to vote. As you can see, women did not have a lot to say about what happened in Iceland during the last century. In fact, when the Women's Alliance ran for parliament in 1983, there were only 3 women members of parliament. And as you can see on the graph, the number of women tripled in that election in 1983. They went from being 5% of parliament to 15% of parliament. And it's only in the past 10 years, since 2009, that women have had a fairly equal representation in the Parliament of Iceland. Women only broke the glass ceiling in the snap elections of 2009, called after the collapse of the government following the global financial crisis of 2008. That year, women went from being 32% of Parliament to 43% of Parliament. And since then, the number of women in Parliament hasn't dropped below 1/3, as you can see on the graph. And if you're wondering why we've had so many elections since 2009, you can see these are 5 elections in the past 10 years. This is one of the results of the global financial crisis, which hit Iceland particularly hard, causing the collapse of all the major banks. The Icelandic people still haven't regained their trust in our political institutions or in institutions, and only one government has managed to serve out its full term since then. This is, of course, a matter of great concern to us, but it's beyond the scope of this talk. Now, what does this mean that women finally have equal representation at the highest level of the government? Well, the legislation that is proposed by a gender-equal parliament is more inclusive, since it's written by a more inclusive body of legislature. Let's look at some of the measures that have been passed by a gender-equal parliament in Iceland in the past decade. Now wait. Yeah. In 2009, we banned the purchase of prostitution. We are one of the few countries in the world to pass the so-called Swedish model, whereby it's not illegal to sell one's own body for sexual services. However, it is illegal to purchase sex and to sell other people's sexual services, i.e., it is illegal to pimp or run a brothel. Several other countries have passed similar legislation Norway, Canada, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and France. In 2010, we passed legislation mandating gender quotas in boards of companies with more than 50 employees. Corporate boards in Iceland must have at least 60-40% representation of either gender on their board. The same year, we passed a law banning employers from requiring nudity from their employees. That is, we made commercial stripping and strip clubs illegal. In 2011, police were given authority to remove domestic violence offenders from their homes. In 2012, we introduced the Equal Pay Standard, a pay management system that helps employers to prevent salary discrimination. This standard was released on a voluntary basis, but in 2017, we passed a law mandating that all companies with 25 or more employees use this standard in their payroll scheme. And I will be revisiting this standard later on in our talk. In 2015, we passed legislation requiring that the government budget be gender sensitive. That is, that the budget of the Icelandic state must be analyzed for its effect on women and men, and inequalities corrected. Now I want to look more closely at some of the more useful measures that we have passed in Iceland, policies that have been fundamental in creating a more equal society. One of the more useful legislations that we have passed is one that mandates that all companies with 25 or more employees need to have a gender equality plan. This requirement means that employers need to have thought about how to achieve gender equality within their workplace. These plans address issues such as equal pay, stating how the company will go about eradicating the gender pay gap in the workplace. The plans address how the company will make sure that women achieve equal access to jobs in the company, fair promotions, and equal access to job training. The plans also address how the company will guarantee work-life balance, structuring work schedule to fit in with daycare, encouraging men and women to share equally in taking time off work to take care of children, and reducing overtime. And of course, these plans should also address sexual and gender-based harassment and violence in the workplace. In Iceland, women and men work. We work a lot. The most recent figures are for the third quarter of this year, when 86.1% of the men were in the labor market and 78.5% of the women. Men worked on average 44.5 hours a week, and women worked on average 36.9 hours a week. And last month, a new European study was released showing that men and women in Iceland work for far longer than other Europeans. Icelandic men work on average 48.8 years during their lifetime, and that's 10.5 years longer than European men on average. And women in Iceland work equally as hard. They spent on average 45.2 years in the labor market. In fact, the working life of women in Iceland is so long that Icelandic women work longer than the European men who come in second place, Swiss men who work on average 44.9 years. And the fact is, Iceland, we cannot afford to lose anyone from our labor market. We are so small that we need everyone participating in our society. We can't afford to waste the talents of anyone, especially not women's talents. Here is a graph showing the labor force participation in Iceland between 1920 and 2017. As you can see, in 1991, women had already reached almost 80% labor participation, and this rate has not gone down. The reason women have been able to fully participate in the labor market since the 1990s is that we now provide universal daycare. In Iceland, children are guaranteed daycare after the age of 2. In 2017, 95.6% of children between the ages of 2 and 5 were enrolled in kindergarten. Children who are not guaranteed daycare before the age of 2, but lucky parents are still able to enroll their children starting from age 1. In 2017, 46.7% of children age 1 were enrolled in daycare. And we can thank the women who entered the parliament and who entered the city and town councils in the 1980s and 1990s for our daycare system. Daycare was not a political issue until the 1980s, when the Women's Alliance made it a political issue. Remember, a more inclusive legislative body makes inclusive legislation. Another issue, which wasn't really within the purview of the all-male parliament of the 20th century, was the issue of maternity and paternity leave. The current parental leave legislation in Iceland was passed in the year 2000 and guarantees parents to 9 months in maternity and paternity leave following the birth or adoption of a child. 3 months are tied to one parent, usually the mother. 3 months are tied to the other parent, usually the father. And 3 months are available for the parents to divide between them as they choose. The government-funded maternity-paternity leave fund issues payments to parents who are on leave equal to 80% of wages that they had before taking leave, though there is a cap on payments. And I cannot emphasize how popular and how beneficial this legislation has proven to be in Iceland. In the year after the law was passed, in 2001, 82.4% of fathers applied for paternity leave, a number which quickly reached to 90%, remaining steady until the financial collapse of 2008, when it began to drop. After the financial collapse, caps on payment from the maternity and paternity leave fund were lowered, making it hard for people to take maternity or paternity leave. In 2017, only 77% of new fathers applied for paternity leave, the lowest number since the legislation was passed. Recent legislation has raised the cap again on maternity and paternity leave payments, and a legislation is now before Parliament increasing the amount of leave to new parents to 12 months, 5 months tied to the mother, 5 months to the father, and 2 months to share between them. We are working diligently to pressure the government into taking the necessary steps to restore the maternity and the paternity leave system. The newest tool in our toolbox to ensure equality in the labor market is the Equal Pay Standard. This Equal Pay Standard is a set of rules and guidelines to analyze the pay structure within a company, to show whether or not men and women are paid equal wages for the same or equal value of work. When companies and institutions have fulfilled the requirements of the standard, they receive certification that they have complied with the standard. The Equal Pay Standard was introduced on a voluntary basis in 2012. In 2018, the standard was made mandatory for all companies with 25 or more employees. So why did we make the Equal Pay Standard mandatory? We have had legislation that was supposed to guarantee equal pay for women and men for a very long time. In fact, we in Iceland passed the first legislation mandating equal pay for men and women over half a century ago, in 1961. We passed a more comprehensive legislation in 1976, and an even more comprehensive one in 2008. So why are men still being paid more than women in Iceland, despite this legislation that is supposed to guarantee equal wages? One of the reasons equal pay legislation in Iceland has not worked is that the burden of proof has always been on the employee. So how does equal pay legislation work usually and in the rest of the world? Well, first, a person needs to find out that they are being paid less for their work than their colleagues. Then this person needs to have the resources to do something about it. They need to have the financial resources to seek the help of a lawyer, the social resources of a supportive network of family and friends, and the psychological and emotional resources to sue their employers. And if their case is successful, if the company is found to have discriminated against the person in pay, the compensation is on an individual basis, not on a universal basis. That is, the person who successfully sues for pay discrimination receives compensation, but the wages of their colleagues are not corrected. So what the Icelandic equal pay certification law does is that it shifts the burden of proof away from the employee to where it belongs, to the employer. In Iceland, we've had legislation guaranteeing equal pay since 1961, but men and women are still not being paid equally. This, in effect, means that employers have been breaking the law for 67 years, or is it 57 years? Today, employers in Iceland are required to use this standard to correct the wages of all their employees to prove that they are in compliance with our long-standing equal pay legislation. So I want to use this opportunity to note that the Icelandic equal pay standard was written as an international ISO standard and has already been translated into English. So there is nothing stopping other countries, such as Japan, from taking the standard and adapting it to local use, to adapting it to the needs of the Japanese labor market, and to introduce it as a standard in Japan. So, all right, but away from the selling. So, what is the income gap between women and men in Iceland today? The gender pay gap in Iceland is now around 16.1%. But the total earnings gap between women and men is much higher, 26%. And the difference between those two figures is that one is calculated on an hourly basis and the other one on a monthly basis. We at the Icelandic Women's Rights Association prefer to look at the earnings gap rather than the pay gap. And the reason that we do not use the gender pay gap calculations is that we feel that it does not fully represent inequality in society. In fact, the so-called unexplained gender pay gap in Iceland is very low, only 3.6%, according to the Icelandic Bureau of Statistics. However, there are many variables which explain the parts of the pay gap. For example, women's labor participation, women who work part-time because of family or household responsibilities, gender segregation in the labor market, that so-called women's jobs get lower pay, power and influence, for example, the number of women in boards or managerial positions, longer absences from work because of childbirth, gender stereotyping, etc. Although these factors explain the gap, they do not justify the gap. There is no progress without grassroots organization. Icelandic women have gone on strike 6 times to protest the gender income gap. The first time we walked out was in 1975, when 90% of women left work to protest income inequality. We walked out again in 1985, in 2005, 2010, 2016, and we walked out again this last October, this time not only to protest income inequality, but also sexual harassment and violence in the workplace, stories of which have been shared in recent months on social media using the hashtag #MeToo. These stories have made it clear that our fight for gender equality in the workplace cannot only be about equal pay, it must also be about safety in the workplace. I want to show you a short video that we made about the Icelandic women's strike of 2016. Unfortunately, we still haven't had time to make a video about the strike that we had this October, but so we'll go back 2 years in time. But Noriko is going to help me set it up, I think, the video. Thank you.
Burt með launamismun! Út! Burt með ójafnrétti! Út! Burt með ofbeldi! Út! Burt með staðalmyndir! Út! Burt með rasisma! Út! Glæsilegt! Lægri laun en karl. Ef jafnrétti væri einfalt val, þá stæðum við ekki hér.
If there is one thing that has made Iceland a more gender equal country, it is our strong women's movement. All of these changes that we have made as a country, the legislative changes that I have described today, were made because women rose up, they came together, and they organized for change. We organized for our right to vote. We organized to create our own political parties when men would not allow us to advance in theirs. And we organized to protest the enduring structural inequality in our society. It is through this grassroots organizing that we have been able to change Iceland to be a better society. Not a perfect society, but a better society. In Iceland, for the past 10 years, more than half of the high schools in the country have begun teaching gender equality and gender studies to their students. These classes were not created by the government or by school authorities, but by individual teachers who decided that they wanted to change the world and to teach our children how to be better citizens, how to be feminist, and how to change the world themselves. Interview with the students who have taken these courses show how it has affected them. Nobody wants to be the first, but it's necessary to call oneself a feminist and fight for equality. I would want it done for me, so why shouldn't I do it for others, says one male student. The course changed my life for the better. It gave me a cause to fight for and strength to help others, says a female student. And why isn't this mandatory, asks a third student. And this is a question that we at the Icelandic Women's Rights Association are also asking, and we are now lobbying to make gender studies a mandatory subject at all school levels. Because it is only through education that we can change the world permanently. Our young adults are the most feminist, most equally minded, most aware generation in the history of Iceland. We look to this generation to finish the job, to make Iceland, finally, an equal country for all. Thank you so much for your attention. And I look forward to speaking with all of you later today at the panels and also with you individually after the talks. And I invite all of you to address me as Brunhilde.
ブルンヒルデさん、ありがとうございました。もう一度大きな拍手をお願いいたします。